Welcome to Indus Special. This is Ejaz Haider. In a television interview, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that relations between Moscow and Washington are getting worse and worse. The current administration has approved, in my opinion, several dozen decisions on sanctions against Russia in recent years. Putin's assessment comes ahead of a G20 summit in Japan later this month, at which he might meet US President Donald Trump. For his part, Trump told the media on Wednesday that he would meet Putin at the G20 in Japan. Kremlin had said a day earlier that the idea for the meeting was hanging in the air, and there were no discussions on specifics yet. Trump also told reporters that he hoped the US would have a great relationship with Russia, even as he pledged 1,000 troops to Poland, a step sought by Warsaw to deter any aggression from Moscow. In another move certain to rankle with Moscow, Trump said on Wednesday he was considering sanctions over Russia's Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline project and warned Germany against being dependent on Russia for energy. Interestingly, though unsurprisingly, Putin, in his Thursday interview, contrasted Moscow's troubled relationship with Washington with what he described as its blossoming ties with China, a deepening strategic friendship that is on the radar of US policy makers. Putin was also spoken in favor of China in the escalating trade war between China and the US, however, signaled a conciliatory tone when he said that he hoped that common sense would prevail in the end, that with all of our partners, including our American partners, we can reach some decisions in the framework of the forthcoming G20 that will be constructive and create the necessary stable conditions for economic cooperation. To discuss how the triangular relations among US, Russia, and China will play out, we have with us David Sedney, who's a fellow at the CSIS. We also have Einar Tangen, who's an economist based in Beijing, and Dr. Leonid Petrov, who is based in Sydney. Dr. Petrov, what do you make of President Putin's remarks about worsening relations, and also in the same interview signaling that the relations with China are improving?
Well, it looks like President Putin is, on the one hand, is trying to buttress Russia's strong partnership with China. President Xi Jinping has just visited Moscow a few days ago. The fruitful negotiations were done, and the fourth opportunity sent a strong message overseas that the largest country in the world, Russia, and the largest country in terms of population, China, have strategic partnership. On the other hand, President Putin is talking about relationship with the United States as worsening and declining and deteriorating. I read it as an invitation to the negotiations. We know that President Putin is going to visit Tokyo, and in Japan there will be G20 summit. President Trump also expressed interest in meeting. So President Putin is simply following the traits of President Trump's the art of the deal. First you do an aggressive move and then you make a concession. And this is how I interpret it.
Okay, so are you saying that the sanctions are hurting Russia, and which is why President Putin wants to have some kind of space for negotiating with President Trump?
Of course, sanctions bite. President Putin's popularity, approval rate is declining already for the continuing 2 years. We see that the mass protests, people's appetite for improvement of relations with the West on the rise. And, of course, President Putin understands, on the one hand, relations with the West might be fruitful on economic terms, but opening up and improvement of relations with the West, again, might undermine his own ability to rule single-handedly. And also when we see it from the example of North Korea, for example, other dictatorial regimes, that in order to stay in power indefinitely, the strong man, the dictator, should demonstrate the image of aggressive surroundings. If you are surrounded by the enemies, if the nation is in crisis, then there's going to be continuing support for the leadership of one man. And I think President Putin is happy to rule as long as he can. And for that, he needs to create crisis And relations with the United States don't need necessarily to be peaceful and amicable, but by going, strategically and headlock with the United States, sends the message to the Russian population that President Putin is the savior of the nation, and who else, if not President Putin, can improve relations and improve the domestic livelihood of the population.
Okay, so recently we've seen protests which erupted over the charging and arrest of one of the journalists. And of course, they had to let go of him. And apparently, President Putin has also removed some of the police generals on that entire Bosch thing. Is that reflective of people's, what shall I say, like the unpopularity of President Putin's strong arm policies domestically?
Yes, some observers already claim that President Putin now bent under the pressure from the public opinion. Yes, Ivan Gasanov, the forefront journalist who was an investigative journalist, was actually working on the topic of corruption. Yeah. And President Putin, not himself, but the important and significant elites decided to get rid of the vocal whistleblower. And it was done in a very rude and provocative way by simply framing him as a drug dealer. And of course, and he was the person not on the limelight elsewhere, but at least in the Moscow protests, clearly showed President Putin and his administration that the popularity and the appetite for changes and independent courts and the necessity of independent media in Russia and also elections should be restored, because previously we saw that the dictate of corrupt judges and rigged elections can destroy the democratic institutions. So I think President Putin is now at the crossroads, whether to demonstrate a strong-willed one-man single-handed leadership, or to delegate some powers to people who might actually to show that the world that Russia is still a democratic nation, that Russia is a part of the West, and what has happened, and the journalist was released and all charges were dropped.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Dr. Petrov. David Sedney, how do you look at it? So we know that President Trump personally wants to improve relations with Russia, but of course the establishment is looking at what they think are Russian irredentist designs as far as the old Soviet near abroad is concerned in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And of course, the Crimean playbook that we saw. So is there some kind of a difference between how the president wants to deal with Russia and how the establishment in the U.S. wants to deal with Russia?
I would actually phrase it a little bit differently. I say there's a difference between what President Trump says and what the strategic realities are. And so while President Trump has, since he was running for office, said that he would be able to, in some kind of personal relationship, have good relations on a personal basis with President Putin, and everything would work out on this person-to-person basis. But I think what we're seeing now is the reemergence of reality. Person-to-person relations between leaders are not all that important, despite what President Trump, President Putin, and others may think. The strategic reality is that the United States, Russia, and China's national interests are, in many areas, moving towards greater confrontation and less cooperation. Despite what President Trump has said, what he did in sending 1,000 troops to Poland was a much more powerful signal than anything that he says about meeting with Putin or anything like that. And that is what I think Putin is reacting to. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that in all three countries, these leaders are weaker now than they were a year ago. the decrease in Putin's popularity comes about, that was just discussed, comes about because economic conditions in Russia are getting worse. The average person is worse off, and they're unhappy about that. In the U.S., President Trump
but David,
growth is not happening.
David, I know,
And
but
so
the World Bank, came up with a report 4 days ago, which actually looks at a certain uptick in the Russian economy, and they're saying that it's recovering.
That was about the macro Russian recovery, but I'm talking about the living standards for the average Russian.
Sure.
The problem with the economic structure in Russia, from my view, is that it's very heavily top-weighted, as is the U.S. in many ways. So the benefits of the kind of economic improvements that the World Bank was talking about flow almost exclusively to a very small group of people. But the average Russian is feeling that they're not as well off as they were 2 or 3 years ago. In the U.S., you just had the leaders of almost all the major U.S. corporations, including the stores where President Trump's constituents shop, at Costco and Walmart, sending him a very strong letter saying that his tariffs were going to hurt the average American consumer to the tune of $2,000 a year. So a lot of President Xi is facing a declining growth economically in ways that he's not figured out what to do. So all three of these leaders are facing economic problems, but there are also some real strategic issues involved here. So the Chinese expansion into the South China Sea is creating tensions. Russia's continuing occupation of Crimea and its aggressive military posture in Syria is creating problems. And when these tensions happen, people respond by raising tensions. So I think we are entering a much more dangerous period for the world. Miscalculation might be the biggest danger of all. And I think there's a real question as to whether any of these three leaders is up to managing those tensions.
As Professor Mearsheimer said in 2003, that's the tragedy of great power politics. David Sedney, stay with me. Let me go to Mr. in Beijing. Mr. Tangen, the idea of a Russian-Chinese cooperation, as I talked about in the introduction, President Putin in his interview has talked about a blossoming relationship. But at the same time, the duality of the Russian-Chinese cooperation on the one hand, and presumably the Chinese power projection in the South China Sea, are both on the radar of U.S. policymakers and also the U.S. Department of Defense. Do you look at this in terms of an inevitability, some kind of clash in the future, because China as an emerging power is going to project power in its near abroad, and that is going to essentially draw the U.S. into a conflict with China?
The inevitability seems to be being pushed from one side. Let's step back and take a little historical perspective at this. With Russia and China, you have two countries who perceived they were humiliated. China, over the Opium War, and since then the occupation and all these lands that they were just now trying to get back. And Russia, after they believed they were duped into dismantling the USSR with false promises. And I don't think in either case you can say that they were wrong. So you have these two countries who have now been named in a strategic white paper by the U.S. as, in essence, adversaries, who surprisingly are coming together against what they see as the larger power. The U.S. is still militarily, politically, and economically a hegemon. And they have the power right now, are using this kind of big stick diplomacy to beat not only adversaries like Russia and China, but also on their neighbors, on traditional allies, using the threat of sanctions and anything else, military withdrawals, etc., in order to get their way. I mean, it's almost as if Donald Trump had watched the Hunger Games and decided that this was the model upon which he wanted to make America. In essence, putting the U.S. at the center of the world and in creating bilateral treaties that would, in essence, make everyone else a vassal state. So going forward, yes, it is a very dim prospect if the U.S. continues this idea that it can dominate the world simply by doing it. Now, let's look at something else. This is perhaps misplaced aggression. The fact is, the United States over the last 30 years has collected two-thirds, the U.S. and Europe and the other first nation countries have collected two-thirds of the world's profits. Yet, in every one of those instances, those first world countries, their middle classes have declined. 90% of the U.S. actually, over that 30-year period, experienced a 0.4% decline in real income. Now, it seems that instead of blaming those who were responsible, they're in essence saying that both China, Russia, and everybody else is to blame for them still being the largest and most powerful country on earth. It would be a very strange thing if you're living somewhere in Africa or places where there are developing nations and you're hearing a small, sad song that the U.S., which is 5% of the population, consumes 1/4 of the world's annual resources, is somehow a victim of circumstances. So we have this odd situation where the U.S. is reacting and saying that everybody else is at fault, and it's pushing.
Mr. Tangen, let me come in here. Are you suggesting that if there is a future clash or the inevitability, if we were to use the structural realist argument about the inevitability of this kind of clash, that it's going to be because of the US and not because China as an emerging power will project power, which we do see it doing in the South China Sea?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily just about China. I think if you look around, it's quite clear that Donald Trump wants to make sure that the world is beholden to the United States. So he's, in essence, rejecting multilateralism. He's trying to reestablish the United States as the sole hegemon and the maker of rules, although not the supporter of institutions that implement those rules, as we can see.
One of the arguments, Mr. Tangen, one of the arguments against President Trump's policies within the U.S., and especially coming from the traditional sort of inside the Beltway policy-making community, is that those multilateral instruments and mechanisms which actually allow the U.S. to be the dominant power, President Trump, by undermining them, is actually undermining the U.S. hegemony.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. I mean, everyone can see that except Donald Trump. He thinks he's a little bit more clever by half. But this is the kind of transactional nature of his negotiations and his thinking. It's all tactics, very little strategy. In essence, he's doing the exact opposite of what he intends. Instead of bringing the world together and creating peer pressure through multilateral institutions on people like China, Russia, whatever, he's in essence made it into the law of the jungle. He who is strongest can do what he wants. So now we, instead of have globalism and talking about and resolving things on a international basis, we're now seeing much more regionalism, bilateralism. These types of things are not going to increase the world's GDP. In fact, it's going to take a big bite out of them.
And absolutely, the World Bank is already talking. The World Bank is already talking about the very negative impact of the trade war between China and the U.S. Stay with me, Mr. Tangen. Let me just quickly back to David Sedney before I let him go. David, what do you think of what Mr. Tangen is saying in terms of the U.S.-China relations?
Changes in the world over the last 20 years have expanded, for example, the ranks of the middle class in China by over 200 million people. That growth in China has been aided by extremely liberal trade policies. In fact, I would argue made possible by extremely liberal trade policies by the United States. In fact, no other country has done more for the emergence of the Chinese middle class in the United States. And there's a lot of synergy, a lot of interdependence among those economies. And so it's not a situation where there's a big bad U.S. and everybody else is in trouble. So again, that's much too simplistic an approach. However, what is happening as China is emerging as a great power, as we've seen in the emergence of other great powers over the millennia, there is the potential for a conflict between a rising new power, China, and a in-place larger power, the U.S. Managing that conflict is a huge challenge for everyone involved. And my question is, certainly, is President Trump up to that? And the evidence so far is no. But there's also the question, is President Xi Jinping or President Putin up to handling those? Those are the issues that I think are important for us to discuss today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Devani, for your insight. Dr. Petrov, going by this argument, and I don't know if you agree with this argument about how, within the framework of realism, the powers in place and, of course, the rising powers and the potential for a conflict. Now, if we look at the China-Russia relations right now, we're looking at Russia with about $1.5 trillion economy and China, which is about $12.5 trillion economy. China is the rising power. It's the stronger of the two. Now, if this differential were to increase, then how would Russia begin to look at China? We can see that in the near sort of future, the Chinese and Russians' interests, as far as the U.S. is concerned, they obviously converge. But the potential of China dominating Russia is very much there. How would Moscow, do you think, react to that?
Well, yes, there is. There are concerns in Russia, in particular, about the strategic partnership, because clearly the nature of this partnership is of dependence, where Russia is considered to be the source of natural resources, while China is a manufacturing and export-oriented nation, which is going to be one day the first economy in the world. And, of course, Russia will be overshadowed by this might and continue to be a simple provider of the resources, and also will need to open its market and potentially give more rights to the Chinese population to migrate to the plains of Russian Siberia, the very underpopulated areas. So the concern is probably can be offset by the ability and nuclear might of the Chinese government, which controls the largest population, which has nuclear weapons and potentially can defend itself. And I think that there's no particular conflict or conflict of interest between Moscow and Beijing, which makes this strategic alliance rather stable and long-term. And the Shanghai Security Cooperation Organization meeting just demonstrated that it becomes even stronger. Now India is joining it, and Iran.
Dr. Petrov, let me reformulate my question. There are two models here. One is, of course, that Russia could be like Canada is to the US or Mexico is to the US. But Russia, through its history, has also been an imperial power in its own right. Do you think that if and when the differential becomes very big, that Russia would be happy to be the Canada to China?
Well, the border between Canada and the United States is transparent, but the Sino-Russian border is heavily militarized and impenetrable. The language, cultural barriers are huge. And,
no, I was talking about the strategic relationship. Well,
even strategic relations, Russia is considered to be European power. And it has our own strategic interests. For example, Trans-Siberian Railway is competing against the One Belt, One Road Chinese project, and there will be no cooperation in this way. They will be trying to.
Okay, I have to get a word from Mr. Tangen also on, because I need to wrap it up. Mr. Tangen, quickly, what do you think of the scenario that I have placed before Dr. Petrov?
Well, quite frankly, Russia will never consent to being a second fiddle. What they want to be is a country under their own right. I mean, 12 years ago, Putin gave a very clear argument as to why he was not invested in the current world order. I think he has a much better view of the way that China organizes things, or at least thinks about them, in terms of leaving countries unto themselves. There is no ideological push, as with American exceptionalism, that is going towards them. So Russia's choice at this point is between being overshadowed by the U.S., who is actively hostile to it, or being economically overshadowed by China, but completely independent and part of a multilateral world as opposed to a subservient one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Einar Tangen, Dr. Leonid Petrov. We'll take a short break here, and at the other end of the break, discuss increasingly fraying relations between the U.S. and Turkey, two NATO allies, on the issue of the purchase by Turkey of Russian S400 A2AD system. Stay with us. Welcome back. One thing is now clear after months of back and forth and strong statements from both Turkey and the US. Ankara is going ahead with the S-400 purchase, even at the risk of sanctions on the Katsa and its removal from the F-35 program. Turkish President Erdogan has said Turkey had completed the deal with Russia and that the systems will be delivered in July. Russia has said it will begin the delivery of the systems in July. Erdogan also said that Ankara would challenge its potential removal from the F-35 program on every platform and hold those who exclude Turkey accountable. Erdogan and earlier Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu's remarks come in response to a letter sent last week by U.S. Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan to his Turkish counterpart, warning that Ankara would be pulled out of the F-35 jet program unless it changes course from its plans to install the defenses. More formally and away from public glare, Turkey's Defense Minister Hulusi Akar has said Turkey is working on a response to Shanahan's letter and that it will be delivered in coming days. What are we looking at? To discuss this, we are joined by Admiral Deniz Kutluk, Ankara, and Dr. Kamran Gasanov in Moscow. Admiral Kutluk, we did some programs previously also on this, and my Turkish panelists insisted that this is a done deal, but they were not very clear about the fact that, they thought that this could probably be resolved bilaterally between Ankara and Washington, and that somehow something could be worked out to allay the American fears that the system could actually pick up information on the F-35 and its capabilities. But it seems that that is not happening. Where is the situation now?
I think Turkey sticks to its legitimate decision taken a long time ago and considers it's a sovereign right, considers it's a necessity for the air defense of Turkish territory. Therefore, there is no point of return at this moment. That point has been long past. And the F-35 deal, Joint Strike Fighters deal, is at stake at this moment as we all read it. But this is not in the same bargain chip. Whatever happens to the eventual fate of F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, Turkey could find a way how to get out of it. But Turkey sticks to S-400 air defense missile system. And on the one hand, and on the other, Turkey is persistently following the agenda that if there is a technicalities to be addressed for the benefit of the alliance and for the benefit of the Lockheed Martin, producers of F-35, this needs to be addressed together.
We keep hearing about these technicalities, and as I said previously when I did a couple of programs on this, my Turkish panelists, experts also talked about these technicalities, but it seems that this is not happening, and there is a clear difference in perception. And I completely agree with you that Turkey, as a sovereign state, as a sovereign nation, is legitimately within its right to decide what it wants to do which weapon system does it want to purchase. But obviously, since this is a program, the F-35 program, which is led by the United States, Turkey is one of those 6 or 7 countries that are part of this program in terms of manufacturing parts of it, which is why I think the presidential spokesman, Ibrahim Kalin, actually said that the F-35s, which are Turkey's right, will most certainly be delivered to our country. But it seems that there is a difference of perception here between Washington and Ankara, and it's not really bridging. Won't you agree with that?
There's a disagreement, of course, in the difficulties they claim that there will be. Yes, there's a difficulty to understand what those discrepancies will be if we deploy both together, F-35s and the S-400s. First and foremost, S-400s are going to be purchased because of the standalone requirements beyond our alliance requirements to defend Turkish territory, and you can match with this system with F-35, or you don't have to, because currently there is no such necessity.
But Admiral, as a military, as a very senior military officer, you would agree with me that the ground air defenses and the fighter aircraft are always integrated as one system, and therefore, if you have the ground air defenses that are part of another system, and you have the fighter aircraft, the mainstay, which is a completely different system, and these two systems are manufactured by two countries that are not exactly allies, then there is a problem.
In a face value, that may be true, but in reality, that is not to have to be the same. Okay. You can, at this moment, in the alliance perspective, as in NATO as a whole, this air defense business has very limited scope defending the territory of the nations. Therefore, there are other elements, instruments, a nation, a sovereign nation, could establish for defending on its own territory. Therefore, whatever claim may be coming from Washington at this moment, they have not responded that this joint staff group to address the same issue. We don't see why. What is the reason behind? Because this claim that they wouldn't match with each other, it's a standalone, and we cannot take it at face value. We should look at details, and if there's a way out, for instance, to match with their interfacing programs, of course Turkey will do its best to make it happen, because Turkey is also a co-partner of the manufacturing of F-35s.
Absolutely, I'll come to that. Admiral, I'll come to that. Let me just hop across to Dr. Gasanov. Dr. Gasanov, how do you look at this situation? And I'm asking you 2 questions here. One is the U.S. concern about the S400 system actually picking up information on F-35, and the other about the possible sort of fallout of this. How do you think it's going to unfold between Turkey and the United States?
So for the first question, I think that we shouldn't ignore actually the concerns by the United States, and there are 2 main concerns. First of all, they fear that these systems are inconsistent with the NATO systems, and when Turkey buys more and more Russian weapons, starting with S400 and then continues with maybe fighter jet, it makes actually some problems for the functioning of Turkish military, not alone, but together with the United States and other NATO partners together in third countries, in third operations. From the other hand, I should actually remind that the United States, their militaries always said that these S-400 systems, they will not be operated by Turkish officers, and at the first stage, Russian experts should study Turkish military how to operate this. And when they operate, they can study the working of U.S. Fighter jets, which Turkey already bought, and this also makes problems. But on the other hand, I also want to add that I don't understand why the United States say that only they are loser in this deal, because if Turkey has S400 and F-35, it can also gain information about this S400 and give them to the United States. And about the outcome, your second question, I would say that now they're waiting. The United States are waiting because some sources say that the deployment will be occurred on July. Others say that in autumn. And until first anti-missile systems comes to the Turkish ground, the United States will wait. And they are now trying to...
Dr. Gasanov, the Turkish president has said that the delivery will begin in July. The Russian side has said the delivery will begin in July. So we're looking at like maximum month and a half. And once the system lands in Turkey, then of course this entire talk about whether Turkey should get it will be over.
I think that at the end, as an end option, the United States always can impose sanctions. And in this moment, when if really Russia deploys these systems in July, but it can delay also, because now Turkish and U.S. sides are negotiating. In this period of time, the United States can start with minimal sanctions and threat to impose more and more. But at the end effect, it will make the things worse, that Turkey will have more incentives to cooperate with Russia, more Russian weaponry. And when it comes to the moment when Turkey will threaten to withdraw from the NATO, and only at that time the United States will understand that it should stop with threats and remind and understand what was the reason behind these decisions. And the reason was that last year Turkey wasn't supported by the United States in Middle East. U.S. supported opposition, supported Kurds, and it supported the sponsors of the
the Syrian problem is another. Yeah, of course. In the Syrian context, once again, the problems between the U.S. approach and Turkish approach. But talking about sanctions, it's very obvious, as you know, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act is automatically going to kick into play unless the president gives a waiver. But there could also be other sanctions. But let me go back to the Admiral here. Admiral, so let's try and game this. The system comes in, which, as I said to Dr. Gasanov also, will essentially mean that this talk about whether Turkey is getting it or not getting it will be over. From there onward, the U.S. will have to decide what it wants to do with Turkey. So one is, of course, CAATSA that I said, the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act. There could also be, of course, the removal of Turkey from the F-35 program, the grounding of, because the Turkish pilots have been trained on F-35. So all of that in the first installment will kick into play. But tell me, would there be more damage in terms of the sort of, confidence, because these are NATO allies, would there also be some damage to that aspect of relations?
I think we don't expect such a sanctions from our allies if that ally continues to commit themselves to being an allies on the one hand. If sanctions come forward, then there will be sanctions coming from Turkey to the United States, operational flexibility in and around Turkey as well. But one should not forget the fact that
you're saying the American, so the Turkish facilities that the U.S. military is using will obviously be off limits for the U.S.
Sure, there could be many more. Not only facilities, but also airspace. Harbors, port facilities, intelligence sharing, etc., etc. But one should also take note of the fact that there are more than 7 NATO allies already have been using legacy units from Russia.
So
S300s, S400s, S200s. Therefore, if they don't harm anyone,
I know that Greece is also interested in S400, but here's the thing.
And Bulgaria.
Yeah. Just give me a sense of what exactly you're saying. Like, okay, so if the U.S. sanctions kick into play, then Turkey will obviously respond. And the Turkish military bases are not just used by the U.S., but also other NATO allies. So will those bases only be off limits to the U.S. military or to other NATO allies also?
Depends. There are dual usable bases, but the mostly used by United States. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. Air Force have been using and taking advantage of those proximity of those bases to the Middle East operations. Okay. Therefore, of course, there will be, if setbacks comes forward, then repercussions will follow. And one of repercussions will be, as Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated this morning, that sanctions will meet with counter-sanctions.
Okay, Admiral, since I have to wrap up also, quickly, give me a sense of what do you think is the best scenario here? What do you think the U.S. should do and, in terms of resolving this?
I think it's not the end of the world if we don't buy F-35s and if we employ S-400s, and we will be more secure than ever in our territory. And gradually, our allies will understand that S-400s won't harm anyone's business, because at this moment, as you follow, the Israeli F-35s are flying next to S-400s deployed by Russia in Syrian front. Therefore, if there is such a discrepancy, there will have been harm already done for them. And all in all, time will help both sides to come to the benign positions, I presume.
Okay, apparently the Deputy Defense Minister, Eli Ben-Dahan, has already said that tensions and strains between Turkey and the United States could help strengthen ties with Israel and boost the country's participation in the F-35 program. Thank you so much, Admiral Deniz Kutluk and Dr. Kamran Gasanov. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.